Welcome to Agency Acquisitions and Exits. I'm your host, Peter Lang. Today's guest is Scott Allison, the co-founder of Allison+Partners. This is a global PR agency that grew to over 1,000 employees across 52 offices and used inorganic aqua-hire strategies to get there. He didn't just build a great business. He executed one of the rarest M&A moves, one of my personal playbooks, and then ultimately sold 51% to MDC. Then, after a long 10-year plus earnout, saw MDC get absorbed into Stagwell. Along the way, he built quietly by acquiring smart regional offices, books of businesses, and talent. This episode is not just about navigating market chaos, evolving, unlocking deals that many others miss. It's also about building a company you're proud of. As Scott is in his final stage, in his final time as an agency career professional. Scott's story will give you the framework, a lot of real talk here from someone who's been there, and perspective that I think all of us needs as we're building our own businesses and our empires. So let's dive in. Scott, thank you for joining me.
Peter, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate your time.
Now, you have a journey that we want to unpack. So before we go through this journey together, take us back to the beginning. How did you get started?
Well, I can take you exactly back to the beginning, and it was the summer of 2001. It was a small cafe in Belden Alley in San Francisco, and it was me and Andy Hardy Brown, and I was president of a company, an agency called Connors Communications. Andy was the chief operating officer, and let me set the backstage. We're in the throes of the dot-com collapse. And Andy and I are working at an agency that specializes in .com clients. So you kind of know where this is kind of headed.
It's fun, is what you're trying to say, Scott.
Andy and I sat down. We said, all right, what is going to be the future, this agency? And we continued to, have drinks and discuss. And I guess the more drinks we had, the more elaborate or crazy the idea got. And so we settled in on this idea. Well, what if we went to the owner of this agency, which had offices in London, New York, San Francisco, and LA? And we proposed to her that we acquire the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. We were very familiar. I had built those two offices. And so we did. We took this grand idea to the owner of this agency, and she agreed. And she sold us these assets for $1. And Peter, very shortly after, we thought maybe we overpaid. Because, in addition to that, we took on the liabilities. So we had to take on the leases, our San Francisco and LA. We had to take on the salary obligations. And we also had to take on the vacation time, which becomes, a liability. And so with that, we launched on September 4th, 2001. And we always like to tell people we had a great first week in business. And then 9/11 hit. And it was not something you prepared for. As you're going through all the contingency plans, planes crashing into buildings was not on the bingo card. And then things got really rough really quickly. So that's kind of the very beginning.
Now, just to give some context around that, which is why did she feel comfortable selling you the West Coast business? Just give us some context to her situation.
Well, I think that Connie Connors really saw that the company was headed towards some difficulties. And again, it was really driven by .com clients. They were going under in mass, going away in mass. Revenue was dropping. And I think she thought this was an excellent chance to give up some of the liabilities.
Yeah, free yourself.
Focus in on the offices, particularly in New York. London was pretty small, but New York is where she was based. It was where she was sitting. It's where she had launched the company. And I think she felt very comfortable with that. The West Coast probably seemed like more of a headache and a liability than a benefit at the time. And she might not have been wrong. I think under those circumstances, that was not a bad stake to take, because she definitely would have been feeling some pain over, particularly after 9/11, those liabilities would have, So in hindsight, I think it was good for everybody.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities where people are divesting business units that are not the focal point of the company or the agency. And when you can find someone who's enthusiastic about taking on the responsibility, being the steward of that business moving forward, that's a relief in many cases.
Yeah, and you and I have talked before, Peter. I think what always surprised me is how not many people look at this as a vehicle. It could be a couple of senior execs at an existing agency. Maybe the ownership is close to retiring, want to thinking about retiring. Why those folks don't approach the owners and say, hey, maybe we can take this on. I'm surprised that doesn't happen more often, honestly.
The agency required, not the business, but the individual capability
Right.
to do that is not something that we really empower people we've hired to be proactive with, which is something I'm on a mission to really help change. So
And I agree.
before,
And as am I, to really educate people about there's more opportunities out there. So what's interesting though is so this was summer of 2001, we orchestrated this. If you had spoken to me in the summer of 2000 and said, do you think you would ever want to own your own agency? I would have said unequivocally, no, zero interest, because I kind of equated it like, oh my gosh, you got to start in a back bedroom by yourself, sitting around seeing if you can land the XYZ sofa company for a small, and that just didn't appeal. But why this worked is it gave us a small group of clients. It gave us about 12 people, small office in San Francisco, small office in Los Angeles. It gave us a small foundation to.
and you did just that. So although you say you overpaid, talk about what you started building with it and kind of how it evolved.
Well, what was interesting is Connors Communication, which we spun out of, was an emerging technology firm, really well branded. That's what they knew. That was the historic that they were known for. So there was no technology emerging in the fall of 2001. I mean, tech was in a massive correction. Now, my background and the background of the two other, co-founders of the company at the time was a little more broader. I had done more in previous lives, more consumer work, entertainment work, professional services. So, man, we had to flip the wheel 180 and go after any kinds of clients. And, it was, God bless them, the clients that came on board, but it was like 1-800 Radiator was a client, and they were selling radiators online. We had a bunch of law firms and things like that. We would go out and try to land anything that we could. And it's funny because people ask me, well, what do you remember about that time? And you know what I always remember, Peter, is I had this old Toyota Camry that my wife had backed into a tree. And I couldn't afford to fix it. We were broke launching this company. So I remember driving around like a madman all over the Bay Area in this beat up Toyota Camry with a dent in it, trying to land clients. And anybody anywhere that would consider an unknown firm with no brand. And it worked to a point, but I would say we got into spring of 2002. It was really dicey. I mean, Andy and I always joke we might have been bankrupt, but we're too stupid to figure it out. But it was really tight. And I remember at one point, call it like June 4th, Andy walks into my office and said, we've got $1,000 in our checking account and a $40,000 payroll due next week. And that was a scramble. And, we were not taking a salary. And I had two small kids to take care of, and my wife was not working at the time. And we went through all of our savings, every nickel to our name. And we were paying our mortgage with our credit card, which is, that's founder no 101. But there's a really incredible story, kind of a tipping point for us. And it came in July of 2002. And we're struggling. We are just barely keeping our head above water. And we get a call from a woman named Patrice Pazinski, and her husband, Steve Pazinski, ran a small firm in San Francisco. Well, unfortunately, Steve suddenly had a heart attack and passed away. And Patrice was looking for a home for her agency. And we spoke. I said, Patrice, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I can barely keep my own head above water, much less take on this business. And she said, well, I've been approached by some of the big agencies, but it just didn't feel right. Talking to you, you seem a lot like my husband and what he was building and the way you kind of take care of people. So we worked out a deal, Peter, and it was basically the aqua-hire scenario where we took on the business and we agreed to pay a commission on the portfolio of the clients that came in. And that was July of 2002. True story, we've been profitable every month since for 22 years plus.
It cured the business.
It cured the business. And it was just that shot in the arm at the right time. It wasn't a massive stake. It was 4 people, 4 great people. And they had a modest collection of clients, but it gave us the shot of revenue when we needed it. And, Barry was fortunate that we gave Patrice a stake in our company. And when we did sell, she was able to make a nice chunk off that. We set up a scholarship for Steve Pazinski through PRSA. It still exists today. I kind of believe too, Peter, that maybe there was a little karma involved too, honestly.
Yeah. When we were in our prep call, we talked about how similar our stories are. I too acquired a 4-person agency. The owner committed suicide. Company reverted back to the 82-year-old parents. We had a shared accounting firm. They called me up and said, "We know you're acquisitive. We know you're interested in doing this. If someone doesn't step in here, that whole thing's going to go away." And the owner, who committed suicide, had acquired the company from Barbara Brown. And it was a 36-year-old agency that was a staple in a community. And so my first exposure was, and I did an aqua-hire
I've
deal
always
structure.
said, you and I were, one of the few. It's kismet to connect.
And that's the way I de-risked it. I was like, I'll just give you a commission off of this. I don't know what I'm getting into potentially. And it gave me a shot in the arm. And then I said, why the hell do I spend time doing anything else other than this? Does this exist? Like there's these types of opportunities out there. Now, of course, I developed more sophisticated M&A efforts after that, but I did August, November, February, and I just made this my full effort. And you did similar. Like you've learned this model and you got your shot in the arm, but because this wasn't your only aqua-hire opportunity. So how did you continue to expand the business after that cure was realized?
Well, and I think that kind of dug us out of a hole, and it just got us to a place of profitability. From 2002 to 2004, things gradually, improved. The Bay Area, California, the agency marketing landscape was really tough in this one. And I have always argued it was much tougher than during even the Great Recession, which was not as difficult. But this was a really tough time. And so finally, about 2004, you finally started to see improvement. And that's where we started then saying, all right, this aqua-hire was very helpful. Can we find some other opportunities? And we did. We acquired a small firm, Smith Public Relations, from Steve Smith. Steve was a real veteran in the Los Angeles area and had some really good clients, but he was looking for an exit strategy. So Steve had about 6 people that we brought on board. So it gave us a really nice shot in the arm, in LA. Later that year, another opportunity was brought to us from a small firm in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's funny because people always said, well, did you have like this massive strategy and dots on the map and where you were going to go next? And, not really. I mean, oftentimes it was just where opportunity arose. So I don't think we would have ever really targeted Phoenix so early on. But we liked the business model. It was an aqua-hire deal. We did the deal. And again, 4 or 5 people, few clients in Phoenix. However, about a year later, we had a chance to pitch Best Western Hotels, their headquarters is based in Phoenix. So to be able to say, well, we have an office in your backyard was a huge plus.
So how did you find these people? You're just, Scott, people ring you up when their times come.
I think that, Andy Hardy Brown, who is my co-founder, really focused. We always joke that if the band was the Stones, then I guess I had to play Mick Jagger and he had to play Keith Richards. And he was kind of more in the back, focus on the business side. I was more out in front, focused on new business clients, and he was kind of focused on the back. So he started really engaging with brokers and other people, getting the word out. And yeah, it is, it's small. The word starts to spread that these folks are being acquisitive. And I think people knew that we were looking for opportunities that were not on the radar of bigger agencies, because we couldn't afford that. We couldn't afford to go out and write 7-figure checks to acquire businesses. So we had a pretty limited target pool in the beginning that we were going from. But I think word gets out that that is the pool you're interested in. Opportunities started coming our way.
Did you enjoy it? Because you're kind of sales oriented. Did you enjoy closing
Yeah,
those types
very
of
much
deals?
so, because I think, well, and I give Andy a lot of credit, because Andy was, it's as a side discussion. I've had a lot of people say, God, partners are so difficult. Well, I had the greatest party. Andy is like a brother. He's a lifelong friend, and it was such a great partnership, and we kind of thrived. Are pretty much the yin and yang, couldn't be more opposite. But we really had a philosophical agreement on business and culture and how you treat people. But yeah, it was a real joy. And Andy focused on, it was always grow, grow, grow. And as you know, Peter, agencies can kind of get complacent. You kind of hit a certain point and it becomes like a lifestyle shop. Hey, I'm at the country club I always wanted to be at. Hey, I got my kids into the good schools that I wanted them to be in. Hey, I'm making some good money. And they kind of stopped. Andy was like the engine that just kept pushing, grow, grow, grow. And so we just kept looking at more and more opportunities and opening up different offices, some organically, some through aqua-hires. And then when we got into about 2011 is when we started looking at international expansion as well.
It sounds like you're pretty lucky on both partners. You had a good business partner, and then you had someone who was comfortable with your level of uncertainty in entrepreneurship as well.
Yeah, I would say so. Andy was someone who had done it before. So Andy had built up a really strong agency in the UK. Andy's British, and it was called Greenfield Partners. And he had sold it to Citygate in the late 90s and then moved to New York, became a US citizen. And so he knew the model. He had done the model. And he was always the one said, hey, I think we try to get this up to 10, 15 million in revenue and then look at selling. And so we kind of focused on that. But then it was, 2011, we opened up in Europe. And then we did some actual big boy acquisitions where we actually wrote a couple checks to do an acquisition in China, which was critical for us, and also in Japan.
Well, we don't, don't make that sound so easy. What was
It
that
wasn't.
like for you? Because
It was
international is a different game.
tricky. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. And also we sold a stake in our firm in 2010 to MDC Partners, which is a publicly traded company out of Toronto. They were more versed in the ad agency space, but they really wanted to get into PR. So they took a stake in our business. They were helpful in getting some of these international acquisitions done by A, providing finance, B, providing some infrastructure, but it was not easy. Setting up the structure to do an acquisition in China, it took a year, and you needed to have some of that international finance folks, financial backing. I would not say, hey, if you're out there, go try to do a quick aqua-hire in China. That's not any. And in today's environment, I imagine it's even more difficult.
This is important. A lot of people who are listening to this who are doing their own M&A or about to do M&A and are exploring opportunities go, well, I've heard when I take my eye off of the business and start doing things that are external, the business could potentially suffer because you're doing a lot of things. And yes, it's very helpful to have Andy
It's
responsible,
very true.
but
No,
you're
it's very
doing a
true.
lot of things that weren't.
And that's why you needed the structure again. But it was Andy and I and another co-founder, Scott Pansky. And it was funny. We felt very deliberately, we named the company Allison+Partners. And I had really been pushed to, we want to put your name on the dare. I was really leery of it, Peter. I really didn't want to do it. I really fought it for a long time. But to me, where we found resolution on it is if we could go and partners. And we develop an actual partnership program, an equity model partnership program where these partners could get some equity in the business, but also take on more and more responsibility. So you had Andy kind of leading the charge on acquisitions, and we had other partners. So it really freed me up to be able to kind of do everything that needed to be done. I could never have done this, Peter, if I was by myself. If I was I was the sole owner, the sole CEO. And I think this is where a lot of agencies get themselves into trouble is, the rocket starts to rattle and shake at about 10 million in revenue. And if you don't have those resources within your organization, it's really hard to keep going.
Yeah. And good partners who can own their lanes.
Absolutely.
And you can not worry that you have to step in and do someone else's job because they got it handled. You're talking about MDC. Again, Scott, international expansion was kind of a nice hand wave of simplicity. So was a partial sale to MDC, and MDC later becomes Stagwell. So talk about how that happened.
Well, and again, I think with Andy had always said, because he'd done it before, he'd always said, let's shoot to get the business to 10 to 15 million in revenue. And I think back in that moment of time, I think if you're looking at the, 2007 to 2010 window, 10 million in revenue for a PR firm was kind of the magic number to really start to draw interest. I think that number's a little bit higher now, but back then that was kind of a legitimate number. And sure enough, you started getting nibbles. We started getting approached by, a lot of different firms, and we spoke to all the people you would think we spoke to. And you just never really felt fully comfortable. We had one group that wanted to take the firm and change the name to Protecting the Innocent or Not So Innocent. They want to change the name to something. I'm like, that sounds like Horse and Hound or something. I said, we're not doing that. Our people would not want to, work for something like that. So it was a 3-year odyssey of taking meetings of potential acquirers, a lot of time spent. And we spent 3 years talking to MDC.
Was it a professional process where you had someone intermediary, some broker, or was it something you were just, hey, responding to inquiries?
We were just responding, and that, we probably could have been a bit more organized, and I'll touch more on that in a moment. But we got to know these folks to the point of one of their key guys was Gavin Schwartzman, and we spent so much time with Gavin, he almost felt like he was just a friend. He'd come into town, you'd grab dinner. And we met Miles Nadal, and they were very interested. They had some really hot ad agencies at the time. Crispin Porter Bogusky, he probably up here in their heyday was the hottest ad agency on planet Earth.
Yeah, they're getting a lot of attention.
Really good creative shops, but Miles really said, I think PR is going to have a good future. What I really liked about their model was very light touch. They would take a stake in the business. They took 51%, kept 49%, but it was really hands off. And when I started talking, and they were said, please talk to our other partner agencies. And you talk to them and they're like, sometimes I forget they're even around.
Which
it was such a light touch.
Yeah.
Was really kind of the perfect model for us. So after 3 years and talking to a lot of people, we did make the decision to, sell the 51% stake.
The transaction for the 51%, was it a full commitment? So you were confirming that you were going to sell them at some point 100% of the business, and it was incremental?
We had put call options. And I think the first one came up after 5 years. And we did put another 24% of the company. And so that took us through about 2018. And then we did the final put for the last 24. But like I shared, we had probably the longest earnout in history. The final payment, the final earnout was completed in summer of 2001, 11 years. But it was very beneficial to us because the earnout and put calls were based on EBITDA growth, and the company grew substantially over that time. So we did.
So give us an idea. So 10 million was kind of where you had gotten to, and you're like, this is the time to entertain discussions. You bring on a significant partner. That partner incentivizes you and rewards you with EBITDA growth for future liquidation. And then 11 years later, I think that we're going to give you the award for longest
I know.
earnout.
I know. It's like a
Where did it
dog.
where did it get to in size and scale?
We got to roughly 100 million in revenue.
Did you enjoy that growth period or was it stressful?
I did. I think it was pretty magical. I think from 2001, we saw some of our biggest hyper growth. We did a great deal in Europe. We bought a company called One Chocolate, which was definitely a big deal for us, where we had to put about 3-4 million pounds out in the deal that MDC funded, but that gave us 30 people in London. Really was a big deal for us. And we had opened up in Singapore. Andy took the step of, he had 2 small kids, moved his whole family, he and his wife, their 2 kids, moved to Singapore. And that was really instrumental. So I was focused on Europe. Andy was really focused on Asia. And we saw really hyper growth from 2015 to 2020.
Living a dream. I mean, from where you
It was a
started,
dream. And, say I had, I was, my wife and I were broke when we were younger. I didn't even have a passport, Peter, until I was 40 years old, and was not familiar with international travel. And all of a sudden now we've got offices in China and, Tokyo and Singapore and Thailand. And so I was spending, 2 times a year, we'd go on these major trips to Asia, and we're doing a lot of trips to Europe, and kind of exhausting at the time, but really just fantastic. And I remember the first time when I walked into to meet with our team from Beijing, and you just had that moment looking around and seeing like 30 people sitting there, and it was awe-inspiring, and the responsibility, because I now have 30 Chinese citizens that I'm responsible for. And
privilege.
that was a really, big deal, very awe-inspiring. And some of my favorite memories of all time would be, spending that time in Europe and Asia, and that growth cycle. So that kind of took us all the way to the pandemic. It was a whole different animal itself. But yeah, really hyper growth from 15 to 20.
What skill sets did you have to learn that stand out to you now? Like, what are the things? Because when you started this, now you're doing a job doesn't even reflect what you started doing when you started your career. So, what did the job look like, and what did you feel like you needed to turn into for that to be successful?
Well, I think that we were fortunate. When I started the business, I was like 37. So I had a pretty deep background. I knew the agency business. I knew the agency business kind of inside and out. I think that the scale was, and the growth had to come from, when you're running a global company, it has to it's very ambassadorial. You really have to have a level of diplomacy to relate to your people, your colleagues, potential clients. And so that was, I think, where you had to really raise the game. You had to learn a lot more about, accounting principles, and we had to can steadily have the growth. In 2016, we really had to bring in a global CFO, the woman who's still with the company today, Julia Farrell, and she came from Dentsu, and she was used to running global operations, because all of a sudden you're operating, 13 different many companies, currencies, and things like that. So it gets a lot more complicated. You look at the working in Japan, the administrative level is probably one of the most difficult in the world, and very complicated. And to have somebody, a local person there who's the president of Japan, knows how to work with the Japanese guy, it gets a lot more complicated and intricate when you're running a global business. So I think it was a constant learning curve on that level.
Well, you mentioned hiring or poaching, however we want to describe it, from Dentsu, right? A CFO of a Japanese headquartered or formed network company is a great way to level up your competency. Who else did you maybe recruit or join the team that gave you this confidence in those latter stages of the career?
Well, we continue to really add senior people throughout Asia, in individual offices and some regional leadership. And we did the same thing in Europe. And so really just kind of up leveled the people that we continue to hire. You get to 2020, we had 24 partners, within the firm, some based in Europe, some based in Asia. So consistently kind of looking to upgrade, the talent level. More into integration, We just completed one of our biggest deals in the last February. We brought on a company called Sidekick, which really pushed us into experiential and integration. So you continue to build out. In San Francisco, we bought a studio, which really launched us into having our own video department integrated. So you're adding on all these pieces, as the business and the offering. And for us, Peter, it was like, they say share of stomach for a consumer food group. It was just share of marketing budget and really striving to be able to tap into just more and more areas there. And we called it kind of the horizontal growth, the vertical growth. So A, we were adding more capabilities that clients wanted. And B, we were going to different dots on the map. So really seeing, and we've got Dexcom's a great example right now. They work with 20 of our offices. So it was kind of a growth of service, growth of location.
Any mentors for you specifically along the way? Anyone who you helped you, guide you, shape you?
We had some great consultants, along the way. I think Andy and I were, because we were like brothers, and it was just, you could just, we were business partners. We were like brothers, we kind of mentored each other in some ways. We filled in the gaps, but we had some great folks. Had a great guy in Europe, Michael Murphy, a friend to this day. I've had a great business coach for, 12 years, Nigel Lineker, who's out of the UK as well, who's constantly been able to bounce ideas off.
Yeah, it's helpful because you don't just build this thing because you have some master plan, as you were alluding to. It's kind of, it grows from
and
the
it's
life.
kind of fun because the master plan, or even what it's like if you're trying to develop a 5-year plan. Even those are awfully difficult to do. I think we were very opportunistic, and you take what the world's giving you at times, and you look where you see there's market opportunity. It could be a great aqua-hire. It could be a more traditional acquisition. It could be making a significant hire. And I remember we hired a guy named Matthew Delacroce, and he was sitting in my office in San Francisco, and he said, "I'm going to build you a $5 million corporate practice." And I said, "That's good, because it's zero right now." And, Matt really did. He delivered on that and really built and launched kind of our corporate practice. So we always, and Andy was really good. In addition to finding acquisition opportunities, he was really good at identifying talent and really people that could be entrepreneurial. And there's a real art to it, Peter. I'm sure you've been through this too, where we hired some folks sometimes from the biggest agencies, but we found that they really didn't know how to sell and really didn't know how to develop leads and really growth. They would tell you, "I was involved in the Coca-Cola pitch." And I'd be like, "I get it. You had a couple slides in the presentation, but I want to know, where did the Coca-Cola lead come from?" And you'd kind of get this blank stare. And so we really needed to identify those really go-getter hunters who knew how to identify the leads and close the lead. And my experience, Peter, I don't know what yours is, there's not many people that can do that.
No, they're running their own shops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Andy was very good at finding those kinds of people.
There is a more significant turning of events that happens towards that 10-year plus earnout. MDC gets acquired. So
yeah, MDC it started off kind of slowly. So MDC was having some struggles and I start to lose track a little bit, Peter, but call it 17, 18, kind of in that window. And Mark Penn, who ran his own holding company called Stagwell, made a significant investment into MDC. And for a time period, he was both the CEO of MDC and the CEO of Stagwell. MDC was a publicly traded company. Stagwell was a privately held company. And over the course of, into early 21, the move was made to integrate those two firms into one. And Stagwell, kind of rebranded it as Stagwell. It was MDC Stagwell. It is a holding company and publicly traded company today.
Yeah, and that was a big move.
It was a big move. And, I think you have to always be prepared. I mean, honestly, we sold our company to MDC. but MDC had a lot of changes, and Miles moved on in about 2015, and you had to deal, with some new folks there. And then, Mark came along, and you have to adjust. And I think you have to be flexible. And I always tell people, look, if you sell your business, you have to be, any scenario could happen. And even today's buyer may not be tomorrow's owner. And that's something that you might have to contend with. But it worked well. We figured out a way to grow, and Stagwell was very helpful to us in doing the deal with Sidekick. We did another big deal where we bought Pros Communications down in Brazil, and it was our first venture into South America. And we could not have done that without Stagwell. Stagwell had a really strong M&A team led by Jason Reed, and actually made life a little easier for us because they could do more due diligence.
Did it have where was Stagwell's involvement in your deal? Because I mean, you're still at the very, very final throes of it.
Well,
What was the considerations?
the deal, it was under Stagwell's watch that our final payment was made in the summer of 21. And they were very gracious and, honored that deal, of course. So then we were 100, all equity was gone, everything had been sold. And, they did offer a very nice contract for Andy and I to stay on for 22 and 23. Excuse me, it was actually 21 and 22. We had a 2-year deal. And it kind of had a rollover provision. So then we rolled over into 23. But it was 23, and Andy and I talked for a long time, Peter, of like, when do you really look to fully exit the business? And so we had maxed out the acquisition, and we really felt that there was more to do, and it might be time to pass the torch to, a next, a second generation, next gen leadership team that we had been very carefully grooming for a long time.
And I don't want to say you didn't have a choice, but they're very fortunate you did stick around, actually. Because you could have taken that opportunity to
I know a
say,
lot of times, founders don't stick around for a variety of reasons, but we felt very good that we were given a voice, a seat at the table. We felt very good that they understood the growth plans. There were some positives. MDC didn't really understand the PR world as well. They came more from the creative ad side. So we always kind of felt that we were having to educate them a bit about PR. Where Stagwell, you look at Mark and Jay, they came from the PR world. So they understood more of the challenges and trials and tribulations, through that. But you did reach a certain point as we went on another year in 23, and it was 23. I decided to give up the CEO role, pass it to Jonathan Haidt, had been with us since the beginning. He started with 2001. I kind of knew he was ready, and I was chairman in 24. And then you just kind of reach a point. Andy and I had, we don't really make knee-jerk decisions. Things are usually pretty well thought out, discussed, making sure that we've got kind of consensus. And, my approach was, Andy, I still would like to do other things. I still have kind of that entrepreneurial bug. And I think we've really taken this to such extraordinary heights. We were named Agency of the Decade for 2000. We had been named, Best Place to Work Year, Agency of the Year. I was fortunate and blessed that I was put into the PR Week Hall of Fame. And you kind of felt like, okay, we've conquered all the worlds, and what do we still want to do? And we kind of both agreed that we had different things that we wanted to pursue as well. I was really interested in getting into film, in a film production company, and I spent almost 40 years on the agency side telling other people's stories. And I still wanted to tell kind of my own stories. And so launched a production company, and we're just putting on the final touches on our first film, which is on the fans of Chelsea Football Club. And my son and I are talking about a startup that he's always wanted to do, and I've never had time to do. So I think the time was right to fully retire. But, I think retire is such a different word in today's age. It's not even retire, it's kind of reload.
yeah,
I feel like just reloading and going back to some of the basics that we loved. And I think we love to build so much.
It seems like you know what it takes to stick around for an earnout. What advice do you have for people, either someone who's selling or someone who's buying, maybe take both positions, about what are the attributes of someone who's going to be dedicated to the business after they've sold a piece of it or sold a material amount of it?
Well, I think you still want to have people that are motivated. I think, and Miles was very good at finding agencies. You look at Peter, the bell curve of an agency life, and they kind of start here, growing, peaking, start to go back a little bit. And I think Miles was very good at finding companies that were going up on the bell curve. And it's funny because he hit 3 massive home runs within months of each other. He acquired Allison+Partners, he acquired Anomaly, and he acquired 72 and Son. Now, these were 3 agencies that were still very much climbing on the bell curve.
People wondered why they sold.
He saw massive growth and keeping people. So there's an art to doing that kind of acquisition. I think the deal where somebody's just looking to unload and go, and it happens, I think everybody kind of loses in that scenario. And I think you have to identify people and give them the latitude and resources to continue to build and grow.
In this phase of, or this chapter of agency life, what are you, as you're exiting, what are you hopeful about the category? And then what are your concerns about this kind of the headwinds, technology, AI?
There's going to be significant headwinds. And it's funny, Peter, because Andy and I have always had this phrase that great chaos leads to great opportunity. And I think we are in a period of chaos right now. It's very similar to where we were when we launched our business, though, in 2001, was massive chaos, technology disruption. You'd come off the first big wave of the internet, and then you saw the contraction. I think there's a lot of similarities in what's going on now with AI and some of the different technologies there and how agencies are going to have to adapt to it. So I think we're looking at it's the Big Bang Theory going on right now. I think you've got this IPG Omnicom merger, which obviously I have no stake in or vested interest in. That is a collision. And I think you've got that, and you've got a ton of really talented senior people that are out on the market. So out of this big bang, I'm convinced that you're going to see some really great new agencies get developed. Agencies that are really unencumbered, they're small, they're private, and they're going to be able to really do some interesting things and really embrace some of the new technology. I think the risk we have inherently with AI, and every agency, myself included, will look you in that and say, we're doing a big thing with AI. It's bullshit. No one has really figured out how to monetize it. And that is still going to be the final frontier of who really starts to make it.
You and I talked about also being concerned with the quality senior folks in the industry who are being laid off and, thinking about what's next for them because they're being pushed out by this younger demographic or this tech side of agency life. What's your message to them?
I think I've had to deliver this message. I think, unfortunately, we live in a world of ages. And, I think there is a lot of almost unprecedented level of senior talent that is on the marketplace right now. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I think these are folks that are going to have to take a step back and say, I believe if you've ever thought about starting something or building something, now is the time. Because I've been very blunt saying you may be out of work for 9 months to a year. So you can bang your head against the wall for 9 months to a year, grinding out resumes, and have a pretty grueling, at times humiliating interview process. Or do you want to invest that 9 months unemployed to start to build your own agency, to start to build your own company? And I think if you look at out of that chaos comes that opportunity. And as you and I have talked about, Peter, I think to explore some aqua-hires. You've got a couple talented senior people. They may want to team up and then look at other agencies that they might be acquire.
Or do what you did, which is instead of going out and starting your own dang thing and starting from scratch, maybe don't start with all the liabilities, go out and find someone who wants to transition out and take responsibility of
Absolutely.
that
And I'm
business.
surprised it doesn't happen more often, Peter, but I absolutely think this is a great opportunity. We acquired a firm in 2013 and gave us 20 people in the Pacific Northwest. It was a firm doing about 2 million in revenue. Our out-of-pocket costs were $50,000. And then we did a commission basis from out there. Those deals are out there, as you know. And I think the tricky piece, though, when we've done a lot of those deals, it was oftentimes with a founder owner who had kind of reached a level of capitulation where they had really believed they'd spent years thinking somebody was going to come in and put the seven-figure check in. And I think, and you've come across this too, I think a lot of agency owners are very unrealistic about what the value. Andy and I've always said, if you're a firm doing, pick a number, 2-3 million in revenue or less, that's a tough sell. You're not going to get private equity or one of the biggest holding companies are going to buy that company. But I think there's a lot of unrealistic expectations of firms like that when they should actually be a little more realistic, be a little more open for things like aqua-hires, finding some up-and-coming folks that will build the company, give you an earnout piece where you can make some money, and it's kind of win-win for everyone.
Or do what you did, which is be proactive at adding revenue in this inorganic way to get to a size then that can potentially afford you a more financially meaningful exit.
Absolutely. And I think if you were the $3-4 million firm and you still want to run it and you still got some thread on the tire, then you should be saying, I want to turn this into a $10 million.
100%.
And aqua-hires are going to be a great way to do that.
Besides getting into film, to continue to tell stories, but in ways that you can now control, the stories you want to say, what do you wish your colleagues, what do you wish the people, your reputation in the industry, what do you wish they say about you once you're no longer day-to-day showing up at the office?
Well, I hope to say that he set a really good example. He treated people really well. I think we were really a people-first culture, and we've had, Peter, people that have been with the companies now 15, 16, 17, 18 years, and people that really put a lot of trust in us. And I think that was really important to us. And we're really grateful for, the thousands of people that did spend some time with us, be it a year or 20 years. And, we're very grateful for those folks. And hopefully people look back and say, Andy had this line once. He said, I hope that when people are assessing their career, they'll look back at us and say, well, that was one of the best jobs I ever had. And it's funny because to this day, I'll get notes from people that left a long time ago, 5-10 years, and say, I just wanted you to know that was one of the best jobs I ever had. And that's all you can hope for. But I'm incredibly grateful for the time, the people that were here, people that gave us some of their time, and around the world, the chance to have colleagues in China and Germany and London. I'll never forget that. And it was such a life-changing experience.
Scott, well, if one person can hear this, and many more will, who can get that aha moment that there's other things that they can be doing to accomplish the scale, build the business that they've dreamt about, and can make a productive next step towards that, this is really appreciated. Because Scott, you went from nothing, buying more problems at what people would call like the midway of a career in creative and in PR, and then built it back up into something that was significant, and then had a whole nother life and career on top of that, being creative, being optimistic, and probably blindly optimistic at times. And it's available to a lot of people if they're proactive. So thank you for being a proactive model of what it can look like.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yeah, and I always tell people too, I say, growth is a decision. And some things seem obvious, but it's not always. So growth is a decision. And sometimes that means there were times, Peter, when we were paying people more than we were paying ourselves. And I've talked to sometimes smaller agencies, and they literally are aghast. But you have to invest to grow, and growth is a decision. I think the last thing I would say, Peter, too, it is about picking the right partners. And I had an amazing partner in Andy. I also had an amazing spouse, Lori, who was the absolute and is the rock of the family. And, I could have never built the company if I didn't have her support too.
Yeah, you are fortunate in finding a life partner and a good business partner.
Absolutely. Grateful.
That
Blessed all around, man.
that is a fantastic, and then to be able to do new ventures with your kids. Scott, if someone's listening to this and wants to reach out to you because once you leave that email address that you've been using for such a long time might not work anymore, what's probably the best way for them to do that?
Certainly, I'm on LinkedIn at Scott Allison, but you can drop me my personal email is allisoncommunications@gmail.com. You can reach me that way.
Well,
Love
Scott,
talking about this stuff like you do too, Peter. And it's been a real pleasure being with you today.
I appreciate you, Scott. Thank you so much.
Thank you.